Hello and welcome to this new episode of histoTALK. My name is Charlotte Jans and I'm a program manager with the events department at the German Federal Agency for Civic Education, shortly BPB. histoTALK is part of histoTALK Online, a platform we launched on 8 May 2020 to share and discuss global perspectives on the history of World War II and its relation to present and future. Today, we also cooperate with BPB Connect and our international networks, especially the Eastern European Network for Citizen Education, or briefly put, the ENC network. It is a network of organizations and experts aiming at promoting exchange and development of knowledge, skills, and values in citizen education in the region of Eastern Europe. So, to come to our topic today, on this day, 79 years ago, Nazi Germany launched a surprise attack against the Soviet Union, which was its ally against the war in Poland. With the beginning of the invasion, mobile killing units began the mass murder of Soviet Jews, and the occupation also led to the death of millions of Soviet prisoners of war and Soviet civilians. Today, we will talk with 3 experts about the memory of World War II in Eastern Europe. If you have any question, feel free to post them in the chat on YouTube or as a comment via Facebook. We will open the discussion at the end and will forward your questions to our experts. And now let me introduce you to our guests for this afternoon histoTALK. Stefan Creuzberger is full professor of contemporary history at the University of Rostock and director of the Research and Documentation Center of the Dictatorships in Germany at the University of Rostock. In his research, he focuses on German history after 1945, 20th century history of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, the history of dictatorships, and international relations in the 20th century. A very warm welcome to you. Dmytro Hainetdinov is head of educational department at the National Museum of the History of Ukraine in the Second World War. The museum was established in 1974 as the Ukrainian State Museum of the Great Patriotic War and was renamed in 2015. In 2019, 778,000 people visited the museum. At the museum, Dmytro is responsible for the planning and managing of the educational process, among other things. And before he started working for the museum, he studied history at the Taras Shevchenko National University of Kiev. I'm happy to welcome you. And our last but not least guest is Aliaksei Lastouski. He is currently associate professor at Polotsk State University and deputy editor-in-chief of the Belarusian Political Science Review. He studied history and was a research fellow at many international institutes. At the moment, he's conducting a research project on religion in post-Soviet nation building at the Södertörn University in Stockholm. Another one of his research projects and scholarships was rethinking the Soviet memory of the Great Patriotic War from the local perspective, Stalinism and the Thaw, 1945 till 1965. A warm welcome also to you. And now let's jump in and start with our histoTALK. I ask all 3 of you to provide us with an object we can show that is related to the history of World War II, and kindly you have all done so. I would now like to ask each of you to present your object and also tell us what connection it has to World War II for you. And I'd like to start with Aliaksei Lastouski. Which object did you choose?
Yes, can you show this picture of mine?
Yeah. We'll show it. Okay. So the audience can see it now, but we in our chat can't see it. So
okay,
you have to talk about it without being able to see it.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to bring to your attention a photograph of the Hatyn Memorial Complex. It was opened in 1969 on the site of a village destroyed by Nazi punishers in 1943 as a punitive act for a partisan attack. Residents of the village were driven into a stable and were burned alive. A total of 149 people died, and only one adult resident of the village, Iosif Kaminsky, survived, and his son died in his arms. Kaminsky became the prototype of the sculpture, you can see it, which is located in the center of the memorial complex. This case was not unique. The Nazis made extensive use of punitive tactics, especially when partisan movement gained strength. So, memorial complex in Khatyn was supposed to symbolize the severity of the tragedy of the Belarusian people during the war. And on the initiative of the head of Communist Party of Belarus, Petr Masherov, calculations were made of population losses. Officially, for a long time, the figure of 2,200,000 of inhabitants of Belarus who died during the war. So was established this figure, and it's like every fourth resident of Belarus. And these calculations became the basis for symbolism of Khatyn Memorial. Petr Masherov was one of the representatives of so-called partisan clan, which led the country until 1980s. So the idea of Belarus as a partisan country and a country which suffered the most serious human losses became one of the foundations for Belarusian Soviet identity. In last decades, every fourth Belarusian gradually turned into every third Belarusian, although the exact number of losses remains an extremely controversial issue. But for Lukashenko regime, the participation of Belarusian people in the Great Patriotic War became the main element of state version of historical memory, the basis for legitimacy of its power. And just a few days ago, President Lukashenko participated in the reopening ceremony of the renovated memorial complex in the village Barki in Mogilев region. There, the memorial was also created on the site of village burned by the Nazis. Therefore, I will not surprise anyone with the assertion that Khatyn became a symbol of the burnt villages, which is like main visual image of the tragedy of World War II for our country. I don't know,
Okay.
they're supposed to talk about gaps, contradictions of this image?
Not yet. We'll start with that soon. But first of all, we'd like that each one of you presents one object related to the memory of the Second World War. And the next one on my list is Dmytro Hainetdinov. You also sent us a picture of a statue. And so could you tell us a bit more about it? It's quite big, I guess. And you have to switch on your microphone, sorry.
Okay, do you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear
okay. So I selected the monument of motherland in Ukraine, in Kyiv. It is 102 monument, which was erected in 1981. And for me and for our museum, it has a very special meaning. It is the dominating object of our memorial complex, which symbolized the allegoric image of motherland. We know that in Soviet posters, in Soviet official art, the image of motherland was a very special image. It had to inspire people to fight for their country, to fight for the regime against the invaders. However, in our museum, currently the monument is the dominating object, and it is also the main symbol of our memorial complex. Our museum had a very complex history, and this history is complex at the current moment, because when the museum was established in 1974, and then in 1981 it relocated to the current memorial complex with this huge 102-meter statue. The museum was a part of the Soviet ideology, and it had to glorify the victory, the Soviet government, and of course it was the main reflection of the Great Patriotic War myth in Soviet Ukraine. However, currently the exposition and the approach in our museum radically changed, and in my speech, in my next speech, I will pay your attention to the many new expositions and projects developed by our museum. But it changed so much that since 2015 we have even the exposition about the current war in eastern part of Ukraine. Probably it is the most controversial and disputable part of our museum. And why I have selected the Monument of Motherland? On one hand, it symbolizes the Soviet approach of the Soviet narrative of the massive heroism, like it was called in 1980s, when our museum had the big ideological impact on society. But at the same time, everything which happened to the museum in later period is also the reflection of a very dramatic evolution of approaches to the World War II in Ukrainian society. And currently, the critical appraisal of the war history in Ukraine is not completed yet. So the monument itself symbolizes, on one hand, the Soviet myth of the Great Patriotic War. On the other hand, it is the symbol of the fast-changing Ukrainian historical memory of the Second World War. And of course, our museum is a unique one for Ukraine. I can speak sincerely that our museum is the main and the largest museum. It is a national museum which puts some responsibility on us on representing the national vision of Ukraine about the Second World War. And at the same time, it is the very important place where we can communicate with foreign tourists. It is a very popular touristic attraction because you can only imagine 102-meter statue in the city. And that's why, with the help of this touristic attractiveness, we can spread the historical knowledge on Ukrainian history, not only among Ukrainian people, but also among foreign tourists that visit our museum. So it is a very important part of cultural landscape of Kyiv and Ukraine as well.
Okay, thank you for that. Comes to my mind that statues at the moment are a highly discussed topic worldwide, I guess. So now to Stefan Creuzberger, you chose a piece of paper and that had a massive impact on the war. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yes, thank you very much, Charlotte, for the introduction, and thanks a lot for the opportunity to have the chance to discuss with my colleagues from Belarus and Ukraine as well. Yes, I've chosen a facsimile of a document from German military archives, and like you mentioned it, on the first glance, it's just a harmless, seemingly unspectacular looking sheet of paper, but the impact was dramatic because it's the front page of a directive which was released by Adolf Hitler, the commander-in-chief of the German army, in June 6, 1941. A couple of days, or almost more than 2.5 weeks before the German surprisingly attack on the Soviet Union. And this document, refers to, directives how the German army, how normal soldiers should treat political commissioners from the Bolshevik regime. And it obliged from these soldiers that every political functionary from the Bolshevik party, from the Stalinist party, should become shot, should become executed immediately. And insofar it's quite clear, it's a symbol. It's a symbol for the dramatic occurrences in terms of the German war of annihilation, of extermination between the years 1941 till the end of the Second World War, May 8th, 9th, 1945. So in the result of this secret order from Adolf Hitler, well, the German troops were forced to kill political functionaries, and it was an order for official murdering in the name of the German people and the German state. And what about the ending of this war? So in the end, we had 26.6 million, murdered Soviet people, victims who were killed. The majority of them were about 15 million civilians on the Soviet side, the Soviet peoples, White Russians, Belarusians, because the main occurrences of the German occupation policy were mainly focused on that area of the former Soviet Union. And so far, it's really good to have the opportunity to talk to Dmytro as well as to Aliaksei. But also the German side had losses and casualties. Up to 2.7 million German soldiers were killed during these fierce fights in the years 1941 to 1945, and more than 1.4 million civilians were affected by the Red Army when the Red Army, just swept into Germany late in November, December 1944, and the first winter and spring months in the year of 1945. So it's a symbol, it's a symbolic document which could give an idea about the systematic planning of the German side, how to treat the Soviet Union, how to treat the people of the Soviet Union, because the Germans in ideology, the Nazi ideology, wanted to treat all Slavic people as inferior, as subhumans, and we all know the results. It was not only Holocaust, but it was also the unbelievable amount of losses and casualties, especially on the Soviet side, in Belarus, in Ukraine.
Thank you for that input. Now I can hear myself. That's strange. But now it's okay. Yes, thank you all of you. That were really interesting objects you showed us, and I guess it's a really good way to get a first grasp of what we're talking about now. So we have now seen objects each from you. They are part of the memory in your country, but what I would like to know from you now is how has the memory of the war in your country developed over the time? And maybe I start with Dmytro.
Thank you. I think that if we consider the development, the evolution of the historical narratives of the war in Ukraine, we should start from the late Soviet period. I think that 1980s was a turning point. On the one hand, we had the highest level of Soviet ideology, the highest level of Soviet myth of the Great Patriotic War. It was very inflexible. And first of all, it was purposed for emotional understanding of war, not objective, not neutral, very emotional, and understanding of war like the massive process, when the role of individuality disappears. That was important part of the current understanding of war by Ukrainians, because many Ukrainians of older generations, and even me, studied history at school without the critical review. I mean the history of the Great Patriotic War, so-called Great Patriotic War, because in Soviet and post-Soviet countries, all the ideology was based on emotions, and emotions didn't make it possible to reappraise the history of war critically. But I think that the first period when the reappraisal started was Perestroika, 1985, and the first journalists and historians started to review the history of war. First of all, they started to reveal the historical facts that were previously kept in secret or semi-secret in the Soviet Union. I mean such pages of history like the usage of the scorched earth policy by the Soviet government, the tragedy of the prisoners of war, and especially the Holocaust, because I think it is sincere that in Soviet Union the Holocaust was outside the main historical and public discourse on World War II. Then 1991, the period when Ukraine became independent and Soviet Union collapsed, our museum, which was a part of the huge ideological machine before, stopped working of the permanent exposition. And the renovation started. The renovation of exposition lasted 3 years. So in 1994, the new exposition was presented. It was the first time when about such topics as the Holocaust, the tragedy of Soviet prisoners of war, the repressions among the Soviet troops, and the Ukrainian insurgent army, the movement for Ukraine's independence. The last topic was especially scandal because some part of society, especially conservative part, which had nostalgia of Soviet times, they even came to museum to break the glasses of the show boxes. Show boxes dedicated to the movement for Ukraine's independence. But of course, that was a step forward to understand the history of war from different points of view. But probably the path of Ukraine, the path to the historical reconciliation of society was and is very complicated and very painful and full of different conflicts. Probably the next stage happened only in 2014, when Ukraine became the victim of the armed aggression from outside, from Russia, and when many people in Ukraine understood that, in fact, the Soviet myth of the Great Patriotic War, which was very typical in the personal and family memory of Ukrainians, that was the ideological weapon of anti-Ukrainian propaganda. And in 2014 and 15, the very important changes in our museum also took place. I mean, the new title of the museum, I told you, you told, that in 2015, the museum received a new title. Before this, the museum was called the Museum of the Great Patriotic War. Of course, the narratives of the museum, even before 2014, were rather distant from the Soviet narratives. But the new title was a very symbolic act, the very symbolic step step from the Soviet ideological heritage and step to the understanding of war like the very complex and dramatic pattern of events. Then in 2015 in Ukraine, the special law was implemented, the decommunization law. That was a decree that prohibited public usage and demonstration of the Soviet and communist symbols because legally they were equalized to the Nazi symbols. I can say that it had a significant impact on our museum because in the museum the museum artifacts are not limited or restricted by the decommunization law because it is different spheres of public life. And in 2015 in our museum another big event happened. That was the first exposition about the current war in eastern part of Ukraine. But I think that I want to pay attention to another event. In 2017, on the 8th of May, the traditional commemorative ceremony with the president of Ukraine taking part in it was held in our museum. It was called the first minute of the peace. And during this traditional event, there were veterans of the Red Army and the Ukrainian insurgent army present in this event. And they shook hands to each other. I don't want to make very far-going conclusions from that fact, but I think that it was also some measure of historical reconciliation in Ukraine. Probably it meant that some part of Ukrainian society considered that they should not make the internal civil confrontation while the real armed aggression against Ukraine was ongoing, and the historical symbols and different opinions in history should not be made the reasons for such internal confrontation. But currently, I can say that Ukraine still experiences the clash between different models of the Ukraine. Sorry, yes, I think that
thank you.
I will continue to review this issue in next.
Yeah, but it's also very interesting. So thanks a lot for that. But maybe Alexei can now share what it's like in Belarus, because they were both Soviet countries, but now look different to each other, right?
Yeah, right. But I would like to start from Soviet time too, because this was very important for image of war. Already in the Soviet era were some national differences in the depiction of heroical struggle against the Nazi occupants. But for Belarus, as I said, the partisan myth became the country's self-representation. It was based on three pillars. First one is nationwide struggle against the invaders, the country of the widest partisan movement. Second pillar is self-sacrificial heroism, the most heroic country. And second pillar of this partisan myth was unprecedented sacrifice in the name of the motherland, fraternal republic which suffered most from the occupation. And you can see that there was like a competition between Belarus and Ukraine during Soviet period, who was most heroic Soviet republic. Numbers of partisans and underground front fighters were estimated, and there was competition about hero cities, and so it was like special resistance of Ukrainian authorities against a recognition of status of Minsk like a hero city. But this partisan version of Soviet myth of victory, which was used in Belarusian Soviet Republic, its aim was to defend its national autonomy, albeit in a limited form, and claim for a high status in the hierarchy of the Soviet republics. And this national specificity in the common memory of the war became to develop even more intensively after gaining independence. But this new post-Soviet image of war, which is closely connected with Lukashenko regime, it coincides in many ways with the Soviet myth of the Great Patriotic War, but there are some important ways in which it differs from the Soviet version. It has its own specificity, which took shape even under Soviet rule. First of all, the Belarusian war myth foregrounds the huge number of casualties among the Belarusian people. As I said before, that one-fourth Belarusians who was killed during the war was transformed into one-third Belarusian who was killed. And second transformation is highlighting the exceptional role of the Belarusian people in the victory over fascism. Sometimes it reaches phantasmagoric dimensions. I can quote the speech of President of Belarus, Lukashenko, just few sentences. Occupied but unsubdued, Belarus identified a unique phenomenon of nationwide resistance to the aggressor. Everyone, young and old, regardless of gender, nationality, and religion, rose to fight as the enemy. According to authoritative foreign military sources, Belarusian partisans and underground fighters inflicted more damage to the Nazis during the Second World War than the Allied forces in Europe. None of the states captured by the fascists has stretched a strong patriotic impulse. And we see another more dimensions that that it is like strengthening national identity by concentrating on the role of Belarusian people in the victory over fascism. Another dimension that we have more similarities in our victory cult with Russia, and we have like a significance, external dependence on Russia. And so we have to say that, for example, Victory Day celebration on May of 9, it has a symbolical connection with Russian soft power. And for example, we have very symbolical conflicts on how to celebrate Victory Day. For example, even in Belarus, with pro-Russian politics, with post-Soviet symbolism, a lot of initiatives which has origin in Russia. For example, Georgievsky lentочки, how to say it? You know about a symbol is and immortal detachment. All these initiatives were banned in Belarus. So we see that Belarus is trying to find its own way to combine traits of war cult which were found in Soviet Belarus, and to find a new way of how to evoke in and to use it for legitimacy of Lukashenko regime in contemporary Belarus.
Okay, thank you. That was quite a lot to learn. And now to Mr. Creuzberger, where in Germany, the remembrance of the Second World War was also quite different in two parts of Germany, right? Because from 1945 till 1919, there were two German states and they commemorated in different ways.
Exactly, that's the point. So I think in Germany for a very, very long time, we did not have one collective major narrative with respect to public discourses of the war of extermination. You already mentioned it. It was deeply influenced by the Cold War era, and to the fact that between 1945 and 1949, there was, especially in the eastern parts of Germany, established a communist dictatorship, an authoritarian dictatorship. And insofar, the East German communists had a similar view and interpretation of history with respect or in terms of the German war of extermination, like in the Soviet Union, like Dmytro and Aliaksei have already mentioned for the Ukrainian and for Belarusian. It's just for almost the decades till 1985, with the beginning of perestroika. Dmytro already mentioned it, the changes interconnected with Mikhail Gorbachev and a more differentiated view on Russian and Soviet history, and also on the history of the Second World War, the Great Patriotic War. So similar interpretations in East Germany, in communist East Germany. And even in West Germany, in the Federal Republic of Germany, a liberal democracy, you will barely find for the 50s, all over the 50s and also in the early 60s, a critical, well, I would say, confrontation with the German guilt in terms of war of extermination. The major views were deeply influenced by three experiences I would describe, three experiences of violence. So first of all, the violence experience the German soldiers made. And of course, they did not mention their guilty and their policy and their brutal occupation policy. That was no topic within the German society in the early 50s and up to the early 60s. It was also influenced the discussions and the debate we had in the 50s with the experiences and also the insights Germans got in the years 1941 to 1945 to the Stalinist regime and the Stalinist terror in the former Soviet Union itself. So that they thought, okay, it was just a war of civilization, civilizing the Soviet Union. And if I would use one of the terms of this, or one of the ideological terms of this era, to civilize these subhumans, or to some respect, and also to legitimize the fierce fights and the brutal war and the brutal occupation policy because of the Stalinist terror. And especially the discussions we had in the 50s and early 60s, the debates in West German public were deeply influenced by the experiences the Germans made in the last months of the Second World War. So that means the Soviet overtaking and conquering of Eastern Prussia and the eastern parts of Germany, mass rapes against German women, plundering, things like that. That was something which was deeply, well, still in German memory of the 50s. And so these were the main arguments when we had some discussions about, well, the war, the Second World War and the war against the Soviet Union. It was mainly focused on these aspects. You will barely find arguments or critical discussions on to what extent the German army participated in that war. There was, well, the major narrative was it was because of Hitler and the SS and the special forces. They were the only institutions who were responsible for the mass murdering and terror and the exploitation in the areas which became occupied by the German Nazis and the special troops from the SS troops. And it changed. It changed in the late 50s and early 60s when we had the first trials against war crimes, also war crimes in the East and the Holocaust, for instance, the Auschwitz trial in the early 60s. So, but it was interesting to see we did not have the open debate within the West German society. We had the debate and among historians, among the West German historians, who got more and more access to the documents. Like, for instance, I mentioned the commissioner order from Hitler from June 1941. And within, among the historians, they're more and more, the West German historians, they're more and more focused on what happened from the historical perspective in the name of the German state and the German people in the former Soviet Union. And you did, up to the 80s, you did not have these debates and the consciousness among the West Germans what happened in the Soviet Union, about the amount of casualties, all these tragical situations these people had to survive and already had together. They were more focused, the official and open consciousness up to the 80s of the German people, of the West German people, was more on the Holocaust and the 6 million Jews who were killed from the Germans. And what is interesting to know, when we had reunification in 1991, there was a tremendous change also within public memory and the narratives and discussions we had in unified Germany. Due to the fact that the German Bundeskanzler Helmut Kohl had dense connections and good relations to the former president of Russia, Soviet Union and Russia, Boris Yeltsin. They established commissions of historians who together wanted to get through the German history and the German, Russian and Soviet history and their experiences. So this was one of the main steps. We had the start of different exhibitions to put or to improve the German, now all German consciousness due to the fact what happened in the name of Germany. Exhibitions were had in Germany, exhibitions together with Russian historians, which could be seen in Germany and in Russia as well. And it were not only the historians who got through more differentiated through that kind of stuff, but we had also the effects now, luckily, in the end, in the German society. And a critical view and critical narratives in terms of what happened in the years 1941 to 1945, especially in the former Soviet Union and among German occupation.
Okay, so thank you for that. You mentioned you might also have questions for our other two guests. You might like to ask them now or later?
Well, there's one question I have to Dmytro, because of the Ukrainian point of view. You mentioned the year 2014 and the Russian annexation of Crimea. And to what extent did this have effects in your country? Because you also have a big majority of Russians, especially in the eastern parts of the Ukraine. Because you have different nationalities also in your country. And for me, it really would be nice and interesting to know what kind of effects you had and what kind of experiences you had if you take into account and considerations these latest developments in your country.
You have to switch on your mic again, Dmytro. We can't hear you.
Everything is well. So yeah. Thank you for your question. I think that really, if we speak about the aggression of 2014, it had a very foregoing effect on Ukraine, but I think that not all the effects can be observed at the current stage, because really 6 years have passed and the processes launched in 2014, they are not completed yet, and that is the problem. But first of all, I think that in Ukraine nowadays some kind of the clash between different identities and models of historical memory can be observed. Indeed, the Russian aggression had the controversial impact on the historical memory and on the system of the civil values in Ukraine. On the one hand, we have situation when many Ukrainians consolidated in support of Ukrainian position. And it also meant that these people reviewed the Russian system of ideological values, including the myth of the Great Patriotic War. But there is interesting statistics, interesting results of the sociological discovery. So in last year, the rating sociological group investigated how many people in Ukraine in different regions considered Russia to be the aggressive state. In western regions of Ukraine, up to 89% of people recognized Russia as the aggressive state. In eastern Ukraine, which really suffered most from this aggression, only 42% of people recognized Russia as the aggressive state. At the same time, people who responded on this question on the East, they are mostly loyal to the Soviet myth of the Great Patriotic War. So we can see now how different could be the results. On the one hand, Eastern Ukraine straightly suffers from aggression, and currently there is the active front line here. On the other hand, not so many people recognized the evident fact of this aggression. If we speak about the clash of historical memory in Ukraine, I think that we can use the opinion of the Ukrainian historian Yaroslav Gritsak. He said that in the evaluation of the World War II events, we had the biggest separation line of 1939. It means that Ukrainians who lived in the Soviet territories before Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and who lived in territories annexed as a result of Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact had totally different patterns of experiences during World War II. And another Ukrainian historian, Olena Styashkina, thinks that currently in Ukraine there is no opportunity to construct some kind of consolidated model of historical memory. And I think that it is not only impossible, but it is dangerous, because in the Soviet Union, they tried to make some kind of consolidated vision of war, and it meant that they just deleted from historical discourse all the unacceptable topics, the Holocaust, the crimes of the Soviet state, and so on. And that's why I think that the only way of Ukraine nowadays should be just developing the democratic society where all the opinions on the World War II are not the issues of the national security, but the questions to discuss. Discussion and democratic discussion should be the priority for Ukraine in the next decade. Currently, in my opinion.
Sorry, I'm really sorry, but I'd love to talk a lot more time with you, but we've only 10 minutes left, so it was really fast. We've got 3 questions from our audience, and I'd like you to answer them shortly because we have not much time left. So the first one goes, and that's with a reference to the topic or to the motto of our event series, HistoCon, which is to look back and think ahead. And I guess the question goes to Dmytro and Aliaksei. Is there cross-border cooperation in the former Soviet republics? And could one prevent current wars, for example, Ukraine and Russia, when there are also common narratives, but also conflict?
Is it a question to me?
Yeah, it's a question to both of you, and please answer shortly. Maybe we'll start with Aliaksei and then Dmytro.
Okay. If we talk about cross-country projects about memory of the war, I can mention different historical projects with Russian historians, and we have database of burnt villages which was made by common efforts. I cannot remember special projects with Ukrainian historians because we have different paths in memorization of the war, but I think that should be redone, that we have to find a way of dialogue and cooperation too, not only with Russian historians, but with Ukrainian historians too. And maybe Belarus usually can be like a common place for dialogue, not for confrontation.
Okay, thank you. What's your turn on that, Dmytro?
I think that the cooperation between Ukrainian and Russian historians broke after 2014 because we had 2 opposite platforms and different visions, and some ideas and opinions expressed by the Russian historians straightly were dangerous to Ukrainian national security and state unity. I also can't say what common cooperative platforms are between Ukrainian and Belarusian historians, but I think that such platforms exist. From our museum, I can say that we have a partnership between Ukraine and other states, not only in Soviet Union, but other states like Czech Republic, Finland, for example. We conducted the outside expositions dedicated both to the Second World War and the current war in East Ukraine.
And I guess you have also cooperation with different museums, right?
Sure. We have different contacts, and of course with German museums as well.
Yeah. So there's another question, and that's from a German perspective, I guess. Are there discussions about perpetrators? Because, and I guess this question comes from Germany. In Germany, there are discourses not only about victims, but also about perpetrators and their role, as well as so-called supporters. How is this discussed in Ukraine?
If I understood correctly, the question was about different forms of collaboration with Nazis, right? Yes. In Ukraine, this question was rather problematic a few years ago, at least because many people didn't want to hear anything about the participation of the Ukrainians in Nazi crimes or in service of them in the German paramilitary and military entities. But I can use the example from our museum. Last year, we opened the exhibition "Ukraine and Finished War," and it was the first exhibition where we dedicated the special chapter to the so-called Ukrainian auxiliary police. Another chapter was dedicated to the Galicia SS division, and surely we wish to demonstrate both dimensions of this story. On the one hand, their participation in crimes, especially if we speak about auxiliary police, Holocaust, repressions and executions of the Soviet Communist Party members, and so on. And on the other hand, we wished to demonstrate their motives. Their motivation was different, and I think that this question can be for 10 and even more minutes. We don't have so much time. I can just say that in Ukraine, not all the people are ready to learn about such pages of history, but at the same time in our museum we try to demonstrate different experiences and the collaboration of some Ukrainians with the Nazis as well.
Okay. I'm sorry I overlooked Mr. Creuzberger. You wanted to say something, sorry.
Add some one or two points in terms of interstate cooperation. I already mentioned this common commission of historians, which became established in the early 90s because of the initiative from Bundeschancellor Helmut Kohl and Russia's President Yeltsin. And they also debated, the historians had different debates, especially on these difficult topics of German contemporary history. And also it was part of the discussions they had. They also had common publications and where you could see the different interpretations. They also prepared a textbook which could be offered in Russian and German to the broader public. So we had these initiatives, and we also had cooperation, interstate cooperation between NGOs, between German historians. And for instance, there's one NGO, it's the so-called Memorial. It's the memory group or the memory institution in Russia, a private initiative which came up in the late 80s and early 90s in the times of perestroika, just to have to offer the Russian and the Soviet audience different approaches to their own history, also the history perspectives from the down about also the fate of the normal Soviet and Russian people during the times of Second World War and the times of Stalinism, even in the times of German occupation. But speaking frankly, since we look at the latest policy of President Putin and his intentions to establish an authoritarian regime in nowadays Russia, well, this kind of cooperation and exchange of discourses and discussions, it's really, it doesn't improve. It's not encouraging, but it's, of course, getting more and more worse.
So, not good outlook for international corporations regarding, the end of the Second World War and its commemoration. So maybe we've only 3 minutes left, and for our audience, I have just a question. If I want to now look a little bit more into all this history and all what happened afterwards and the different commemoration practices, could you recommend to us where I can find more on that, or where one can find more on that? Maybe it could be a book, or it could also be a website that's interesting and where you can find out more. I guess, Dmytro, your museum has a good web page where you can find out more about it.
Currently, in our museum, we developed few projects, and they are available in English. One of them is called Portraits UA. It is a story it is a database, first of all, the database of stories of Ukrainians who tried to rescue the Jews during the Holocaust. Of course, not all of the stories had the successful ending. Many stories had a tragic ending. And I told you previously about the auxiliary police in our museum, about the representation of this facet of war. Another facet is Ukrainians who tried to rescue the Jewish people. And my colleagues who developed this project also were successful to manage exhibitions dedicated to these stories. Also, we had in our museum we have the page of digital collections. This page is available in Ukrainian and in English. I can recommend you to watch our English website. And one of the deepest collections is connected with the Babyn Yar history, the ravine in Kiev, where the Nazis executed the Jewish people. We digitalized many museum artifacts and represented it online, so to make it possible for people from other countries to get acquainted with this part of Ukrainian history. That is the place which is widely considered the symbol of the Nazi occupation regime and its crimes in Ukraine. Babyn Yar, the ravine in Kiev. I could tell you more, but time is almost over.
Yeah, time is almost over. So, Mr. Creuzberger, I saw you getting a book out of your shelf.
Exactly. Well, there's not a book I have written anyway, but I think it's a publication which is also, I think, also translated into English. And so this is the common language, especially for histoCom. So if one wants to get an idea about the Operation Barbarossa, so the German attack to the Soviet Union and the war of extermination, it's a small book which is published by a historian from Bavaria, from Munich, Christian Hartmann, Operation Barbarossa, the German War in East in 1941 to 1945, and it's all published in English, and so that's really good and important to know. In terms of, different narratives, memory, policy of memory, unfortunately, I could only recommend a German book, which was edited by a historian also from Munich. You see all these Bavarians, they had a lot of academic productions, but it's due to the fact that we have an institution. It's called the Institute of Contemporary History in Munich. So that's one of the ideas, and all these are members of that institute. And it's a publication from Andreas Wirsching. Unfortunately, only in German, but very instructed, very differentiated on Germany and Russia and Germany, the Soviet Union, and their ways of memory and memory policy, history policy in terms of the Second World War. And for our German participants and listeners, this is a book. I think you also could download it already and in the web. So one has to figure it out. Just go to the catalog and ask for Andreas Wirsching. Unfortunately, I don't have the correct title, but I think with Andreas Wirsching and history policy or policy of memory on the Second World War, you easily could find that publication.
Okay, thank you. And Alexei, do you have a tip for us?
Yes, I would like to recommend you to get in touch with results of a research project under direction of Misha Gabovich from Potsdam. And it was a project about Victory Day celebration in different countries from Berlin to Vladivostok, I think. And I took part in this project, and some articles based on this research were published on site Uroki History in Russia. My article about Victory Day celebration in Minsk was published too. And we hope that monograph publication will be published this year on the results of this project. And I would like to recommend you to get in touch with Историчная мастерня, historical workshop in Minsk. It's a team of independent historians. They are strongly connected with German historians, and they made a lot oral history expeditions in Belarus and made a lot of public history events. And they took active part in construction of Trostinets Memorial and exhibition on Trostinets extermination site. And this exhibition made a long tour from Vienna and Germany to different cities and towns in my country. So I think that these public initiatives you have to in touch to.
Thank you. And if it's really short, Mr. Creuzberger, then it's okay. But we're also over time already.
Just one short hint I would like to give. I would like to refer to the website of your institution, the Bundeszentrale für politische Bildung. They also have very instructive, very useful information also on that topic. So it's also useful, especially for our German listeners, to get in touch with your institution or just to get some downloads. This is something I really would like to emphasize and recommend once again.
Okay, thank you for that. We're all happy at the BPB for you saying that. And thank you for the discussion to our guests, and apologies to all, to the audience. We really tried to make the connection better, and I hope you had a good time, except for the technical issues we had. Thank you for watching and joining actively in the discussion. We'll have a next BPB talk coming up on 6th of July, and it will be dealing with post-pandemic futures, intersectional perspectives on a new just world. We'd also be very happy if you checked histocon.de regularly, as you can find various offers there already, which are, for example, digital excursions, a video project, or a podcast, and we'll update the website throughout the year. So there will be more content soon. So now, thank you for watching. Thanks to my guests for taking part. What's really nice discussion, and be prepared for the next histoTALK. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Anna.